Welcome to Module 4 in the Creating Competency in Trauma Treatment series. This module is the last module in the series and is titled Treatment and Resiliency. In this module, you will learn about the principles of trauma-informed care and that these principles underline all the treatment we provide. You will begin to understand the framework for safe and effective treatment, including the phase-based model, which is an evidence-based model for trauma treatment. Lastly, we will go over vicarious trauma and the importance of self-care when working in our profession with victims of trauma. Before we can begin talking about treatment, we need to go over the principles of trauma-informed care. Developed by Fallett and Harris, they started developing these principles in the late 1980s and published these principles in 2009. And these principles should underline all treatment you provide to the individuals you work with. These principles also in healthy organizations can be integrated in all organization activities. So when we go over these principles, we're not just referring to therapist-client relationship, but we're referring to organizational practices around working with people in a trauma-informed care framework. We use a trauma-informed care framework in order to not re-victimize people when they come in for treatment. And therefore, we are not causing more harm in people's lives as a result of them seeking healing from their trauma. There are 5 basic principles of trauma-informed care, and many organizations have expanded on these principles, but we will just move through the basic 5. If you understand and can integrate the basic 5 principles of trauma-informed care, you can provide safe treatment to all the people you are working with. The first and most important principle of trauma-informed care is safety. So we ensure the physical and emotional safety of our clients. And physical safety means that our agencies or our offices are safe and have clear escape routes for both the client and you, the therapist. Providing emotional safety means that you are not going to engage your client in techniques, activities, interventions that will effectively harm them or cause more harm than they have already experienced. Trustworthiness is the second principle, and you see here that we establish trustworthiness through task clarity, meaning that our clients know what we are doing and why we are doing it. Consistency means routines in both inside and outside the therapy session, and consistency can mean that it can even be as simple as a therapist showing up on time for appointments. And then interpersonal boundaries. And interpersonal boundaries points to the fact that we need to develop really clear and comprehensive crisis guidelines for all of the trauma victims we have worked with. Trauma victims often don't understand the importance of boundaries because their boundaries have been violated. So it is our job as therapists to establish those boundaries and maintain those boundaries. When we have established crisis plans for our service participants, and crisis plans includes when they cannot access us. That means we are empowering the clients to use their external resources in order to receive the help they need. Choice is the third principle, and that means that our clients have choice and control in all the interventions and the procedures and techniques we use in therapy. That we need to listen to our clients, and when they prefer not to do certain interventions or techniques, that we listen to them and honor that. That doesn't mean we don't at times use confrontation, but it means that we honor their ability to make choices on their own best behalf. Collaboration means we create treatment plans and goals based on a collaborative effort that both the therapist and the client agree on. Building skills of empowerment means that we work on skill building in therapy session so the client becomes more and more capable of living confidently in their day-to-day life. The explicit the explicit consequences of trauma-informed care means that we are creating an environment that does not re-victimize clients, because when clients are traumatized many times, they have had environments that have lacked these principles. They do not feel safe in the world. They do not trust people. They do not have any choice, especially they did not have choice in being traumatized. Oftentimes, they are victims of agencies, schools, or other people telling them what to do or how to do it, especially in the healthcare professions. And lastly, they very few times people or victims of trauma are gaining skills to feel competent in their lives. So those are the explicit functions of the principles. The implicit functions of these principles, when they're operated on with fidelity and consistency, they can begin to transform and create a new internal worldview in the client. Now that we know the trauma-informed care principles that underline every thing we do in therapy with people that have endured traumatic stress, and really with anybody who comes into our office seeking treatment, now we can move on to approaches used in order to have competency in trauma treatment. This model was based on the ARC model by Blaustein and Kinnenberg to address trauma treatment with children. I have built upon this model and included some arrows to identify and illustrate the integrative approach to treatment. This model is a developmentally informed approach, and it is a neurobiologically informed approach. Essentially, what this model shows us through the the circles and the nested circles is that in trauma treatment, we are first looking at the development of the client's sense of self and decreasing that experience of being fragmented in the world. We do that oftentimes through the therapeutic relationship we develop with the client, with the hopes that developing the therapeutic relationship will provide a remediating and restorative effect to the client's ability to develop relationships outside of therapy. The next function, or the next nested circle, is to regulate emotions and regulate affect. And then lastly, it's to develop a person's sense of competency in the world through skill building. The arrows represent the neurobiological integrative approach. The down arrow and the up arrow reflect the need to incorporate body and brain in approach and provide integration between understanding the body's reaction to stress and the brain's response to the body's response. The back and forth arrows show the integration of the left and right hemisphere. It is important to integrate the logic, linear, and linguistic brain with the contextual, autobiographical, and emotional experience side of the brain. This slide represents the comprehensive competency and trauma treatment framework based upon the last two slides and also the module 3 that you have already completed on the neurobiological consequences of trauma. So you see, as you face the screen, on the left-hand side are the trauma-informed principles. In the middle, we become developmentally informed and target treatment interventions based upon the development, emotional development, many times, of our clients. You see the ARC framework with the attachment of the self at the bottom, but you will also see on the side that it is important to think about the developmental functions as outlined by the theorist Piaget. Piaget said that infants first begin to develop a sense of self through their sensory system and their sensory motor system. So as we are looking at developing sense of self and attachment, we work and target interventions that remediate the sensory motor system, then understanding and regulations of emotion, and then executive functioning. On the far right-hand side, you will see the diagram for neurologically informed. And that means that we are targeting interventions that integrate the right and left hemisphere, the body and brain, top to bottom, bottom to top. We are regulating and providing information and techniques to help the client understand the difference between themselves and others, oftentimes through experiencing remediation of attachment relationship. The internal and external targets developing empathy, self-reflection, and understanding of information processed in the self versus that experienced by the other. Lastly, under neurobiologically informed, we attempt to integrate and help our clients integrate temporal functioning. And temporal functioning simply means sense of time. Sense of time is important because we help the clients understand what is past versus what is present, and also be able to look towards the future. You may get a sense at looking at this slide that we are building competency framework bit by bit. So we started with the nested circles and the arrows, had moved on to the framework we saw in the last slide that incorporated the principles of trauma-informed care and developmentally informed and neurobiologically informed. And now we are moving on to the phase-based model. And the phase-based model is an evidence-based model of treatment, first talked about by Judith Herman, who had been mentioned in previous slides. And this model is essential to providing safe trauma treatment. So you may notice that in phase 2 is trauma integration, and that is the telling of the trauma story. The reason we emphasize phase-based treatment is because many times our clients have gone into therapy and they have moved into telling their trauma story, or phase 2, before they have adequately developed safety and regulation and stabilization skills in phase 1. Therefore, the telling of their trauma story can further harm them, lead to hyperarousal or dissociation, and can essentially put clients off therapy so they don't want to attend again. So we never want to harm any of our clients, and that is why it's very important to keep these phases in mind. So the task of phase 1 is to establish safety, to stabilize the client, and to build skills in order to manage regulation, or in order to regulate affect. In phase 2, that is the telling and the integration of the trauma story. And then phase 3 is consolidating all the gains made in therapy, and then going back into the world as a quote unquote new individual that has moved past their trauma. On the bottom of this screen, you notice all of the other information that we have covered thus far in this module as far as being informed, developmentally informed. The arrow and the red line represent the nonlinear process of the phases. And a lot of times you may work with clients and move in and out of phase 1 through your sessions. And it is not a graduation from phase 1, move to phase 2 graduation, but many times just moving through and in and out of the phases. This slide highlights the tasks of phase 1. So we will go through these tasks fairly quickly, but I will outline the important points. So the first part is establishing safety in the relationship, and establishing rapport. Nothing happens without rapport and safety in the relationship. After that, and part of that is establishing the boundaries of treatment and establishing the norms of therapy. Psychoeducation is an important part of phase 1, and that is discussing with the client the consequences of toxic stress on the body and brain, and as talked about in other modules, helping the client understand what is going on within their systems when they become aroused. In phase 1, you also establish the treatment plan, and the treatment plan is more important than just creating goals and objectives. The treatment plan is an underlying statement that you believe the client and you may work together and healing can begin. Establishing a treatment plan gives hope for the future, and your enduring hope is oftentimes one of the best therapeutic tools that you can have when working with victims of trauma. Once we establish those 4 basic bullet points, we can move on to education about emotions, so the client can start to begin to understand and recognize emotions. And once they begin to understand and recognize emotions, they can separate emotional experience of self and others. They can begin regulating emotions, and regulation often includes scaling emotional states on a scale of 1 to 10 on how they experience the emotion in their brain and body. And once you can scale emotions, oftentimes you can begin to start coping and regulating emotions. Using a SUD scale for emotional regulation is a powerful tool. In phase 1, you also help the client establish their natural, reoccurring support systems in their environment. And these support systems may be family, friends, they may include religious organizations, and they also may include other agencies they use in the community to help them live day to day. In phase 1, we begin to understand what it feels like to have happiness and goodness in life through discovering of strengths and identifying enjoyable activities and helping the client engage in enjoyable activities. We also regain enjoyment by experiencing joy in the relationship. So in this phase, we create experiences and situations where the client and you, the therapist, can experience the joy of being in a relationship with somebody. In this phase, we begin to develop and build self-esteem, and it is important to establish a wellness practice, daily wellness and self-care activities for both the client and the clinician in this phase. The goal of this phase, again, is to provide safety, stabilization, skill building, and emotional regulation. In order to move on to phase 2, the client should be able to tolerate and modulate or cope with strong affect. The client should have established the support systems, and the client should feel safe and have a sense of trust in the relationship to be healing for them. Phase 2 consists of exposure to the trauma through various means. Various means can be used to integrate or metabolize the trauma. It is modulated and regulated exposure, and that is very important to understand that the trauma story is titrated based on the client's ability to manage the affect associated with the trauma. Metabolizing the trauma memories essentially means, if we're thinking about neurobiologically informed, that the information is tolerated on both the right and left hemisphere of the brain. The client can tell the story with logic and linearity and tolerate, as they tell the story, the affect and the visual memory and the experiential memory associated with that narrative. There are many ways, as mentioned, in many evidence-based ways, in order to integrate and metabolize trauma memories. The narrative approach is very common and used in many cognitive behavioral techniques. Expressive techniques may include nonverbal techniques such as art therapy, sand tray therapy, and especially with children, play therapy. Timelines are another effective tool to begin metabolizing and integrating trauma memories. Timelines have a secondary benefit of strengthening temporal functioning, which is the client's understanding of past, present, and possibly future. While we are working on metabolizing the trauma memories, we are simultaneously working on transforming shame and guilt and moving from victim to survivor stance. The bottom paragraph sums up the importance of phase 2 and the functions of phase 2. Exposure to memories needs to happen in a safe environment where the client feels some measure of control. The client should have the capacity to regulate emotions. The therapist should identify when to move forward and when to back off. And this is very important, that the therapist can contain and safely process trauma memories so the client doesn't deintegrate or become so overwhelmed by the trauma memories that they have a loss in functioning. Mastery of the trauma story is the goal. In the story, you understand when the trauma story is metabolized, when the emotions triggered by the memories no longer overwhelm the client. The client gains a sense of empowerment on their trauma story, and they gain a sense of mastery. Therefore, they move from victim to survivor. And the survivor story, the narration that accompanies this survivor story, oftentimes tries to make sense or understand what happened in the grand scheme of life. Depending on the severity and the duration of trauma exposure, phase 1 may take years. Phase 2 may take just as long. Phase 1 and phase 2 are dependent on the client's level of functioning and the healing process, and they're also dependent on the environmental support systems. Phase 3 is usually the shortest phase of trauma treatment, and for sure, for the therapist, it is the most enjoyable phase. So that we liken phase 3 to the butterfly coming out of the cocoon, and the butterfly can no longer behave as a caterpillar, but has to establish a whole new world for themselves and a whole new level of behaviors and functioning in order to enjoy being a butterfly. So victims of trauma move from survivor to thriver. They reimagine life apart from identifying themselves with the trauma. They see trauma as a part of their life, but they don't see themselves as the trauma. The survivor identifies new activities that they would like to learn and participate in, and these are usually called growth activities. So you may see some trauma survivors learning new skills, going back to school, or becoming members of new groups. And the last part of phase 3 that is not mentioned so much in the literature, but is something I found very useful in practice, is going over resiliency factors and teaching resiliency factors to our thrivers so that when they encounter stress in the future, they know that they are resilient and have achieved post-traumatic growth. Resiliency is something relatively new in our dialogue, and resiliency operates on the same continuum as post-traumatic growth and has really come out of the field of trauma. And resiliency kind of signifies or demonstrates how people move through and past their trauma. These resiliency variables have been studied, researched, and have come to be, the variables on this slide have come to be seen as the most prominent characteristics of people who are resilient or who have experienced post-traumatic growth. So the first variable is optimism, or having an optimistic view on life. The glass is half full. Now, optimism does not mean rose-colored glasses or unrealistic optimism. Optimism means that you have weighed the costs and the benefits, and that you believe in the end everything will turn out okay. Facing your fears is another resiliency variable. Having a sense of a moral compass, understanding your value system and your ethics, and also being able to give to others and have a sense of altruism, that you have a purpose and meaning in service to others. The fourth is being part of something that is larger than yourself, and most people find this part in religion or spirituality practices. Number 5 is developing social support networks. And then number 6 is having healthy role models in your life. 7 is keeping body and brain fit. and we know the importance of physical fitness on mental health. Mental fitness is engaging in challenging and growth activities for your brain, such as learning new skills. 8, cognitive flexibility and emotional flexibility means that you can operate in the gray areas of life. You can tolerate emotions, and you can tolerate situations when there is no easy answer. And lastly, number 9 is you begin to have a sense of meaning in your life. You feel like your life has purpose in the world, and you engage in growth-enhancing activities. We have just gone over much information in a brief period of time on safe and effective trauma treatment. We are ending this module with a few slides on vicarious trauma and self-care, because everyone who works with victims of trauma is susceptible to experiencing and developing vicarious traumatic stress. Work-related trauma exposure may lead to compassion fatigue, which means you no longer can care and have compassion for people that you serve. It can lead to feelings of not wanting to go to work or feeling burned out. And it can also lead to experiencing traumatic stress yourself and the symptoms associated with traumatic stress. Vicarious trauma, you may often also know it as secondary traumatic stress or vicarious victimization. We think about vicarious trauma on ourselves as experiencing the same symptoms as our clients. But in an agency, vicarious trauma can also occur when the agency doesn't support the client or the people who work with clients, and therefore people who work with clients may be more susceptible to experiencing burnout. And I say the agency doesn't support, or the political systems or the economic systems don't support growth and healing. But many times the systems that are meant to serve us and our clients are sources of trauma and re-victimization themselves. So understanding vicarious trauma can help us remediate and possibly not re-victimize our clients, and support organizations that don't victimize or re-victimize the people who work with clients. Some more specific signs of vicarious trauma include behavior change, including irritability or anger, emotional fatigue, change in sleep habits, isolation or isolating yourself from your support system, or pushing people who you love away. You may not have the same judgment that you once had, or make mistakes on the job. You may experience intrusive thoughts or flashbacks, or you may just have other broad or global changes in your functioning and behavior. The way we protect ourselves from vicarious trauma is through conscientious and purposeful self-care. And it is essential that we practice self-care daily when we are working with victims of trauma. This slide represents 4 minor things that we can do, or 4 memorable things that we can do every day in order to take care of ourselves, so we can do the work of taking care of others. The first point is recognizing that transitions from home to work and work to home are important. Having rituals or meaning around transitions will help you not bring your work home with you. Some people do something minor, such as tidying up their office and putting everything in place, and then as they close the door to their office, saying goodbye to their workday. As they walk in their house, they say hello to home. The second part is daily exercise. We need to take care of ourselves, our physical and our mental health, just as we are taking care of others' physical and mental health. It is also important to develop good sleep routines. So that means being purposeful about the amount of sleep we try to achieve, and also developing good nighttime habits and good waking habits for ourselves. The third is the commitment to self-care, that we understand that neglecting self-care harms ourselves and the people that we work with. Work-life balance signifies that we make sure we spend time on self-care, take breaks from work when we are feeling compassion fatigue, and understand that even we have limits to the amount of effort and work we can give to others. Many times, as a side note, many times people are talking about work-life integration right now. I personally don't prefer that word. I prefer balance because, as we looked at in the first little tip, that we need to establish boundaries between work and home in order to maintain health. Lastly, I always recommend that clinicians never ask their clients to do what they are not willing to do. We ask our clients to maintain mindfulness skills, relaxation, and calming skills. And we also need to engage in them ourselves. We need to understand the best techniques that work with us, and we need to practice them regularly in order to maintain a healthy nervous system. We are now at the end of Module 4 in Creating Competency in Trauma Treatment series. In this module, we covered all aspects of creating a safe and effective trauma treatment framework. We went over trauma-informed care principles. We looked at a developmentally informed and a neurobiologically informed framework in which to work off of. We looked at the various tasks and goals in the phase-based treatment approach, with emphasis on creating a safe environment for our clients to process and heal from trauma. Lastly, we went over signs of vicarious trauma and highlighted the importance of self-care and daily self-care as we service ourselves and the people around us.